Hey, Robert Mitchell here. Welcome to Christianity for Doubters, episode number 6, A World Transformed. If you're new to my channel, by the way, I am an author, a martial artist, a seminarian, and a deacon in the old Catholic tradition. Alrighty. These videos have gotten to where they take all day, and I've got a lot of seminary work to do, so I'm going to really try to get these things to be more concise, more direct, less wordy, and I'm going to do them in one take. And so the mistakes, you're going to get these things now, warts and all. I don't know what to tell you. And I'm going to try to stop saying So I was doing a full recap at the beginning of each one and sort of working our way through this thing. I'm not going to do a full recap. I'm going to keep it much more brief, but I'm going to do a brief recap. So in episode 1, we talked about the urgent need for wisdom in the world today, the meaning crisis, increased polarization, depression, suicide, retreat into the virtual world, obesity, unhappiness, and so on. We talked about in episode 2 the Christian psychotechnology. We talked about how it works and why Christianity works, how it works as a wisdom tradition, as a way of organizing people, giving them a framework and helping them achieve things and do things and be happier and overcome the problems that come with the meaning crisis. In episode 3, so that we could move forward and remove stumbling blocks, I did some Christian myth busting, and I tried to refute some of the major problems and some of the major stumbling blocks with Christianity. Now, apologetics and anti-Christian busting of myths that are anti-Christian will be done throughout the series, because this is, after all, Christianity for doubters. But I wanted to get some of the big ones out of the way with that episode. Episode 4, I made 2 really concise arguments for the existence of God. There are a number of those. I used the cosmological argument. It's for the existence of God, and then I used my own argument, which I've come to call the evolution of consciousness argument. And I don't know of anyone else who makes the same argument or an argument of its kind other than myself, but that's my original work. In episode 5, we went through the religion of the Hebrews and what made it incredible, unique, and not evolutionary, but revolutionary. All right? So in this episode, A World Transformed, part 1, is going to be a part 2 to this. We're going to talk about what happened as a result of the introduction of Christianity into the ancient world. Sorry about that. Brief interruption. Like I said, not doing 58 cuts of these things. I'm going to do one cut, and you get what you get, and you don't throw a fit. So before we can really get into the topic of this video, which is how Christianity changed the world, I want to begin with this. So we have to do a little Christian apology for you first. So one of the big issues that we have is people want to say that Christians wrote all the history, and so therefore everything that we say about the early church and its influence on the Christian world, on the Western world in the early days of the church, is just written by Christians, and so all that history is just a heap of lies, and we just can't believe any of that. So I just want to quickly address some of that stuff now. All right? So it was during the 4th century, the early 4th century, that the New Testament was formalized, and it became what we call today the canon, the New Testament canon. And that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, and all that stuff. These are the gospel writings and the writings of the Apostle Paul and his letters and all the other stuff that goes in there. People will say, well, basically we don't have anything between the death of Christ in 30 or 33 AD until the 300 or 400 years later. And I just want to tell you that that's just silly and that's just not true. So we're going to run down through this, and because we have a number of resources we can use to track this. So I'm going to run down this list for you briefly. I've got a couple of reference books here. So we have to remember something very important, and that is that you have to understand that if you read the Gospels, maybe you haven't, maybe it's this Christianity for Doubters, so maybe you haven't read the Gospels. So if you even read the Gospels, you see that the apostles who followed Christ were horrible at being apostles. They screwed up, they didn't understand the parables, they didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing, they made mistakes, they didn't understand the essential teachings. When Christ died, they weren't even there. One of them betrayed him and for 30 pieces of silver, and then another one denied his existence, and so all these things. And what happens is after he's gone, now I believe in the resurrection. Maybe you don't believe in the resurrection. This is, after all, Christianity for Doubters. But the idea is that it took time for them to put this stuff together. While he was here, they were all a bunch of Keystone Cops trying to understand what he was doing. Now, once he resurrected from the dead and then ascended into heaven, then they tried to put everything together and they began to write things down. So you're not going to see books written about Christ in the year 34. It's going to take a couple of years for this stuff to get written down, but we can get pretty close to that. You also have to understand that many of the people who were Christ's apostles were unlettered, and these people would have had to learn to write or find other people to write for them. So now that can also be a negative. Now I'll just digress for a moment and tell you a fun story. So there was a person who used to work for me, and she was a wonderful lady, and she is, as far as I know. I haven't talked to her in years, but and she had a husband, and his name was Charlie. And she always told me that I would really like Charlie. I would have fun talking to Charlie. I never had a chance to talk to her husband up until finally we had a company Christmas party. And so, and I had asked her before, what does Charlie do and why do you think we would have fun talking? And she said, well, he's a welder and he works in a metal fabrication job. And he likes to read books and stuff. And that's as much detail as I could get. And so finally at this party, this guy comes up to me named Charlie. And Charlie comes walking in and he looks totally uncomfortable. And he looks like a welder. And he looks like he's a guy who works for a living. He's lean and hard, and his hands are dirty, and they've got like a guy who works for a living, and the dirt's ingrained in them. And he and I started having a conversation. Well, it turns out that Charlie, in his spare time, has become an expert in the Russian novel. And he knows more about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky than I'll ever know. And this was, and I have a degree in English from the University of Virginia. And at the time when I graduated from that university, it was rated the 4th best university for an English degree in the United States. And I studied Russian novels in college. Charlie's understanding of the Russian novel was intricate, detailed, and commanding. And he had basically come to view the world history through the eyes of some of these guys, and he had some very interesting theories about what was coming when the Iron Curtain would fall, and then we would come back together again, and Russia would become democratic. Now, at that point, it was right around the time, I guess, that the Berlin Wall fell. This was quite a few years ago. And the Iron Curtain was descending, and so this is a guy who barely got a high school education, but he had enough interest in it that he went out and he got himself educated, and he had like a 400-page manuscript that he said that he had written, and if it's probably never going to see the light of day. So I just want to say that many people will say that there's no way that the apostles could have written the Gospels because they were unlettered fishermen. Well, Charlie was an unlettered welder and knew more about the Russian novel than most people will ever know. All right. So we need to understand a few essential things about the books that we can certainly say. There are a number of things that are missing in the Gospels and in the letters written by the Apostle Paul that we would expect to see if they were later written. So there is nothing in there about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70, nor is there anything in there about the Roman siege that led up to that. The book of Luke does not contain anything regarding the death of Paul and Peter, even though those characters figure prominently in the story. So we know that Luke and Acts have the same author, and we know that he doesn't mention the deaths of James and John. He does mention the names of James and John, but he says nothing about the death of James, who was martyred in the year 62. So we have some evidence here to suggest that Luke was written prior to the year 70 and maybe even prior to the year 62 when James died. Now, by his own admission, he writes Luke, the Gospel first, and then he writes Acts next. Luke and Acts were written by the same author, and this is not a Christian assertion. This is available to you in the works of Bart Ehrman, who is a famous, he calls ex-Christian Bible scholar. So, the Apostle Paul wrote about Luke's Gospel in the year 63 to 64. So now we're beginning to, and he also wrote about it, and it appears in 1 Timothy 5:17 through 18, as well as in the book of Corinthians. And so we're beginning to see that maybe there's more evidence that it's prior to the year 62. So now we're starting to get into possibly 60 or maybe in the late 50s AD for the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke says that he is compiling the eyewitness accounts, and he's pulling it together by speaking to the witnesses. And he says that in the outset of Luke. That's Luke 1 through 4. Luke 1 through 4. And if you look at the book and you actually read it, scholars will tell you that there are at least several hundred references to the other gospel books, which he references Mark and Matthew. Now, by some reckonings, he references Mark 350 times and Matthew 250 times. And as I've talked about elsewhere in this, the self-referential nature of the Bible is incredible. There are over 63,000 links where these guys reference each other's work. So if Luke is quoting Matthew and Mark in the year 62, then how old does that make Mark and Matthew? So we're beginning to see that they might actually be written in the 40s or maybe the 50s. And remember, we believe that Christ was crucified in 33. So we're getting very, very close. Now we'll look at external sources. I'm just going to run down through these, and this stuff's widely available. I don't want to make another 90-minute video, so I'm trying to do this in some sort of reasonable way. Some quick apology so that we can get into the impact and the story of how Christianity transformed the world. So let's look at some of these early writers. So we have Josephus, who lived from the year 37 through the year 100, who, some of his work has been called into some of the early there were Christian writers who tried to put words into Josephus' mouth because he was such a famous writer, and so they kind of liked that. So there was some modification of those, but we do have some sources. And I've got this reference here. I want to pull this up. Just give me 1 second. So okay. So in 1971, scholar Shlomo Pines was a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he published a long-lost Arabic text. And in that text, there is a long quotation from Josephus. So we know that this was actually, we can be reasonably assured that these are the words of Josephus, who was writing between the years 37 to 100, and that it was not corrupted by later Christian writers. And this is the original text from Josephus. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Okay? So there is at least a sense in Josephus that some of the common things that we assume about Christ and the Christian story were in place at that time. Other famous writers, Thallus, Tacitus, Thallus was a Sumerian historian who wrote a 3-volume account of the history of the Mediterranean. And he writes, of course, about the darkness that befell when Christ was crucified. Mara bar Serapion, who described Jesus as a real person. And here's a quote from him. Well, we won't. Well, we've got too much to cover. I could read all kinds of stuff. Let's see, who else? There was a guy named Phlegon who wrote a lot. He was from the year 80 to 4. I lived from the year 80 to 140. There are numerous Talmudic references to Jesus that were dated between 100 and 200. But I think that for me at least, the most convincing evidence are the works of Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch. Now, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, lived from the year 35 to roughly 117 AD. And he wrote 6 letters during the ramp up to his martyrdom. And he references Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. He references the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke. He references all of Paul's letters and possibly even more of the New Testament canon. He refers to the apostles repeatedly as acquaintances. And he writes to others as if, well, he writes to them in a way that implies that they're also acquainted with the apostles. So please do not believe what people tell you if people tell you that there is no evidence for Christianity prior to the third or fourth century, and that no one's writing about Christianity other than Christians, and that all these myths about Christ didn't come along until later. There is a ton of evidence that all the things that we say about Jesus today were said about Jesus long before the year 70 even. Even if you don't believe that anything was said prior to the year 70, that's less than 40 years. So let's be realistic, please. All right. Now let's talk about the impact that Christianity had on the ancient world. Now, I want to use real stuff here that's common knowledge stuff. I don't want to use stuff that you won't appreciate as a doubter. So let's just take a look here. This is the Wikipedia article, The Role of Christianity in Civilization. Okay? Now, I encourage you to read this article if you're a doubter and you want to know, and this is a pretty moderate, I would say, assessment. And obviously it's Wikipedia, so this is publicly edited. So I'm just going to run down give you a quick rundown of some of the contributions that Christianity has had to Western civilization. And this is just from the intro. I'll cover this. Church scholars preserved literacy in Western Europe following the fall of the Western Roman Empire. During the Middle Ages, the Church rose to replace the Roman Empire as a unifying force in Europe. The cathedrals of that age remain among the most iconic feats of architecture produced by Western civilization. And so on. Let's see. The Bible and Christian theology have strongly influenced Western philosophers and political activists. The teachings of Jesus, such as the parable of the Good Samaritan, are among the most important sources for modern notions of human rights and the welfare measures commonly provided by governments in the West. Long-held Christian teachings on sexuality and marriage, blah, blah, blah. Christianity played a role in ending practices such as human sacrifice, infanticide, and polygamy. Christianity greatly affected the status of women by condemning marital infidelity, divorce, incest, polygamy, infanticide, and abortion. All right, we're going to go into a little bit of detail on that. All right. Just another quick note. According to 100 Years of Nobel Prizes, which was a review of Nobel Prizes between 1901 and 2000. Let's see. 65% of Nobel Prize laureates have identified Christianity as their religious preference. And 78% of the winners of the Nobel Prize for Peace were Christians, and many of them Christian evangelists. Okay. All right, the value of human life. This is from the article, all right? If we turn to the roots of Western civilization, we find that in Greek and Roman times, not all human life was regarded as inviolable and worthy of protection. Slaves and barbarians did not have full right to life, and human sacrifices and gladiatorial combat were acceptable. Spartan law required that deformed infants be put to death. For Plato, infanticide is one of the regular institutions of the ideal state. Aristotle regards abortion as a desirable option. And the Stoic philosopher Seneca writes unapologetically, "Unnatural progeny we destroy. We drown children who at birth are weakly and abnormal, and whilst there were deviations from these views, it is probably correct to say that such practices were less prescribed in ancient times. Most historians of Western morals agree that the rise of Christianity contributed greatly to the general feeling that human life is valuable and worthy of respect. Christianity formed a new standard higher than any which then existed in the world. The justice teachings of Jesus are closely related to a commitment to the sanctity of life." Okay? The role of women. Rome had a social caste system. Women had no legal independence and no independent property. In early Christianity, as Pliny the Younger explains in his letters to the Emperor Trajan, people from every age and rank and both sexes are in the religion. Pliny reports arresting 2 slave women who claimed to be deaconesses in the first decade of the 2nd century. In fact, we don't really see the banning of women as deacon and deaconesses until much, much later. I think roughly the year 1200 is when that happened. So it seems as though the early Christian church was even more liberal than some versions of Christianity even today, which I think is interesting. Okay. The New Testament refers to a number of women in Christ's inner circle. There are gospel accounts of Jesus imparting important moral teachings directly to women. See, today we read the Gospels and we see all these stories about Christ having interactions with women and spending time teaching them wisdom. At a time when, in most of the world, you wouldn't have spent any time talking to a woman because people would have believed that they were mere infants. Let's see. According to it was common in the Greco-Roman world to expose female infants, that is, to the elements, to let them die, because of the low status of women in the society. The church forbade its members to do this. Greco-Roman society saw no value to an unmarried woman, and therefore it was illegal for a widow to go more than 2 years without remarrying. Christianity did not force widows to marry and supported them financially. Pagan widows lost all control of their husband's estate when they were remarried, but the church allowed widows to maintain their husbands' estates. Christians did not believe in cohabitation. If a Christian man wanted to live with a woman and have relations with her, then the church required them to be married, and this gave women legal rights and far greater security. Finally, the pagan double standard of allowing married women to have extramarital sex and mistresses was forbidden. Jesus' teaching on divorce and Paul's advocacy of monogamy began the process of elevating the status of women so that Christian women tended to enjoy greater security and equality than did women in the surrounding cultures. All right. Now we'll talk about children. We know that killing children that were unwanted or leaving them outside to expose and die was common. What people don't realize is that many exposed children didn't die. They were taken up by speculators and they were raised to be slaves or prostitutes. So we're not just talking about aborting them, we're talking about them being picked up and used the same way that you would pick up a discarded tool or a sweater or something and use it. It may be safely asserted that the trade in exposed children became impossible under the influence of Christianity. Okay. Let's see. Emperors and kings their power was uncontested. We know this, that Roman emperors were common, executing people, doing all kinds of stuff. But, under the Roman Empire, you can read all about it. It's really fun. The Emperor Theodosius. So here's an interesting one. So this is, what year was this? So this is in the 4th century. When the Emperor Theodosius I ordered the punitive massacre of thousands of citizens of Thessalonica, Bishop Ambrose admonished him publicly, refused him the Eucharist, and called on him to perform a public penance. And the emperor submitted to the penance. Can you imagine that happening prior to Christianity? All right. So in the Dark Ages, monasteries were models of productivity and economic resourcefulness, teaching their local communities animal husbandry, cheese making, wine making, and various other skills. They were havens for the poor, hospitals, hospices for the dying, and schools. Medical practice was highly important in medieval monasteries, and they were best known for their contributions to medical tradition, but also made many advances in science and astronomy. For centuries, nearly all secular leaders were trained by monks simply because it was the only education available. All right. All right, popes began to challenge the power of kings. Because see, remember, people want to think that kings, that Christianity is the first one to call kings into the rulership of kings into question. Okay, this could go on. I could go on with this stuff forever. All right, here we go. The philosophical foundation of the liberal concept of human rights can be found in natural law theories, and much thinking on natural law is traced to the thought of the Dominican friar St. Thomas Aquinas. According to Aquinas, every law is ultimately derived from what he calls the eternal law, which is God's ordering of all created things. Okay? So this is where this stuff begins, guys. One cannot and need not deny that human rights are of Western origin. It cannot be denied because they are morally based on the Judeo-Christian tradition and Greco-Roman philosophy. They were codified in the West over many centuries. They have secured an established position in the national declarations of Western democracies and have been enshrined in the constitutions of these democracies. Human rights are not a universal doctrine, but are the descendant of the particular religion known as Christianity. Charles Malik was a Christian academic, diplomat, philosopher, and theologian, and he was the guy responsible for the drafting and adoption of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, moving on. All right. Social structures before and at the dawn of Christianity and the Roman Empire held that women were inferior to men intellectually and physically, were naturally dependent. Athenian women were legally classified as children, regardless of age, and were the legal property of some man at all stages in their lives. Women in the Roman Empire had limited legal rights and could not enter professions. Female infanticide and abortion were practiced by all classes. In family life, men could have lovers, prostitutes, and concubines, but wives who engaged in extramarital affairs were considered guilty of adultery. It was not rare for pagan women to be married before the age of puberty and then forced to consummate the marriage with her much often older husband. Husbands could divorce their wives at any time simply by telling the wife to leave. Wives did not have any similar ability to divorce their husbands. And then the early church fathers forbade all that stuff. And if you think it stopped magically because people just suddenly decided that that's what they should do, you are sorely mistaken. All right. This is from the slavery category. Christians were the first people in history to oppose slavery systematically. Early Christians purchased slaves in the markets simply to set them free. Later, in the 7th century, the Franks, under the influence of its Christian queen Batilda, became the first kingdom in history to begin the processes of outlawing slavery. In the 1200s, St. Thomas Aquinas declared slavery a sin. When the African slave trade began in the 1400s, it was condemned numerous times by the papacy. Okay? Now, this is not to say that all Christians are perfect and that they followed the rules and that they did what they were supposed to do. Everything in the Bible says that the whole teaching of the church is that people are filled with sin and error. We're talking about the goals of the church here. And you can read the whole papal bull of 1839 by Pope Gregory XVI, which goes into great detail and talks about how horrible slavery is. It's also important to note that when the Spanish military, which was famous for its ill treatment of Amerindian women and men and children, at the same time, Catholic missionaries are credited with championing all efforts to initiate protective laws for Indians. They fought against their enslavement, and they began within 20 years of the start of the Age of Discovery. And so, 90% of the Indians that people want to say that Christianity slaughtered were killed accidentally by disease. And let's also remember that slavery and human sacrifice were both a part of Latin American culture before the Europeans arrived. Indian slavery was first abolished by Pope Paul III in his 1537 bull, Sublimus Deus, which confirmed that their souls were as immortal as the Europeans, and they should neither be robbed nor turned into slaves. Now, do people follow the teaching? Not all of them. All right? All right. Now, we'll talk about letters and learning briefly. For centuries following the collapse of the Roman Empire, small monastic communities were practically the only outposts of literacy in Western Europe. In time, the cathedral schools developed into Europe's earliest universities, and the Church has established thousands of primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions throughout the world in the centuries since. So, almost, all right, so then I hope that we don't, I'm going to do this again. It's just so exhausting, but I just want to point out that Gregory Mendel was an Augustinian abbot and was a pioneer in the study of genetics. William Ockham was a monk, and he was the guy that developed Occam's razor. Roger Bacon was a Franciscan friar and one of the earliest advocates of the scientific method. Belgian priest Georges Lemaitre was the first to propose the Big Bang Theory. And then we can just run down the list. Albertus Magnus, Nicola Steno, Francesco Grimaldi, Riccioli, Boscovich, Kircher. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. All of the Christian scientists and men of learning. I mean, it's crazy. All right, now, what else have I got here in my notes? I sort of glanced over it, but let's just read this. As the Roman Empire fell, as all through Europe, matted, unwashed barbarians descended on Roman cities, looting artifacts and burning books, the Irish, who were just learning to read and write, took up the great labor of copying all of Western literature, everything they could lay their hands on. These scribes then served as conduits through which the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures were transmitted to the tribes of Europe, newly settled amid the rubble and ruined vineyards of the civilization they had overwhelmed. Without this service of the scribes, everything that happened subsequently would be unthinkable. Without the mission of the Irish monks, who single-handedly refounded European civilization throughout the continent in the bays and valleys of their exile, the world that came after them would have been an entirely different one, a world without books. And our own world would never have come to be. So, I mean, I could stop there, but we're going to go on a little bit more, and I've got a great video coming up that I'm going to play for you. It's about a 10-minute segment for another video, and you're going to love it. I'm watching the clock there where I'm at, 40 minutes, because I want to get this done under an hour. All right. Social justice. Let's talk about social justice. Historians record that prior to Christianity, the ancient world left little trace of any organized charitable effort. Now let that sink in. Historians record that prior to Christianity, the ancient world left little trace of any organized charitable effort. Christian charity and the practice of feeding and clothing the poor, visiting prisoners, supporting widows and orphan children has had sweeping impact. After the death of Eusebius in 370 and the election of Basil as Bishop of Caesarea, Basil established the first formal soup kitchen, hospital, homeless shelter, hospice, poorhouse, orphanage, reform center for thieves, women's center for those leaving prostitution, and many other ministries. Did you see how many firsts were in there in the year 370? Basil was personally involved and invested in the projects and process, giving all of his personal wealth to fund those ministries. Basil himself would put on an apron and work in the soup kitchen. These ministries were given freely, regardless of religious affiliation. Basil refused to make any discrimination when it came to people who needed help, saying the following: "The digestive systems of the Jew and the Christian are indistinguishable." There is a striking resemblance between Basil's ideals and those of modern times. Certainly he was the most modern among the pioneers of monasticism, and for this reason, if for none other, his work is of permanent interest. As a result of Christianity, charity became a universal practice, not previously known of in the world. And just a quick footnote, let's just talk about the number of Catholic institutions as of 2000. There are 408,637 parishes and missions, Catholic parishes and missions in the world. There are 125,000 schools, over 1,000 universities, 5,853 Catholic hospitals, 8,600 orphanages, roughly, almost 13,933 homes for the elderly and handicapped, and there are 74,936 dispensaries, leprosaries, nurseries, and other institutions in the world. Okay. I don't know if I need to say more than that. I hope that that is enough of an impact to have you understand that you can't just throw out Christianity and say it's stupid and silly and worthless and so on. And just so you know, let's say that you believe that Wikipedia is a wretched hive of scum and villainy and that it can't be trusted and none of that information is true. It's all made up. All made up. Then we're going to dodge over here and we're going to watch this little segment of this video. And I just want to make sure I get the volume right here.
See this in a sense in a religiously pluralistic polytheistic system in the ancient world.
I might not be quite loud enough. All right.
But there's no question amongst them that
Now, this is a conversation between Tom Holland, the author of the book Dominion, which I've talked about before, and Paul Vanderklay, who is a pastor in the Christian Reformed tradition. And they're having a conversation about Christianity and its impact on the world. And Paul here is talking about how religion and there was prior to Christianity, there was no secularism. Secularism did not exist. Religion and government were one. They were one thing. In the same way that they are united in Islam. In the Islamic world, law and religion are linked. And so it's not until St. Augustine's City of God that we begin to understand that there's such a thing as secularism. He used the word seculum, which goes to the French séculaire, and then from there on to secular. And that refers to things that are of the age, things that are going to pass. And so Augustine says that, or Augustine rather, says that the Christianity is more concerned with the eternal, that is the things that are unchanging, rather than it is with the seculum, the things that are changeable, that are of the hour, right? Things that change frequently. And so he's describing this, and so we're going to get to Tom's statements here in a moment.
Rather than my participation in the sacramental system of troops that you can put on the field.
Okay.
I think there is something completely distinctive about Christianity that no other way of understanding humanity's relationship to the divine has really made central to itself. So if you look at what Christians come to call polytheists, the idea that the Romans, for instance, had gods for everything. Notoriously, they had gods for door hinges. There was nothing in the Roman world that wasn't in some way governed by the divine. And so it's not just that the gods are present in springs and trees and roads and even cities. It's also that they are kind of the equivalent of insurance companies. Everything just as we take out insurance, so the Romans had religio, a bond, which you pay a god, and then the god will look after you. So whether you're a businessman or a soldier or obviously an emperor, everything you do is done in the context of your relationship with the god. The god is looking over you. If things go wrong, it's because you haven't paid the god enough religiones. If it goes well, it's because you have. There is a sense in which the divine and the human is absolutely interfused. Now, if you look at the Jews and then Islam as it emerges, of course, the Jews do not accept that there are gods everywhere. Neither, of course, do the Muslims. There is only the one God. But that one God has given a framework of law that enables his holiness, his presence on the earth to be everywhere. So whatever you wear, whatever you eat, whatever you do, the rhythm of your life, that God is everywhere. And the fact that he is enthroned, up on the heavens, far distant from the springs and the trees that people in their folly had previously worshipped, doesn't alter the fact that if you are obedient to Torah, if you are, if you pay attention to the Sunnah, you are going to lead a life in which every aspect of your life is governed by a sense of the divine. Christianity goes on a different course, and it's one that evolves over the 2,000 years of its existence. And it's manifest right from the beginning. There are little acorns scattered around the New Testament. So the most obviously in the account of how Jesus is asked, should we pay taxes to the Romans? And he, of course, famously asks for a coin. And there on the coin is the head of Caesar. And so he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God's. And this sense of a tension between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth, which is Caesar's kingdom, is a dynamic that's there throughout the New Testament and throughout the early emergence of the church. And there's a sense in which Christianity emerges with a consciousness of itself as a parody of the Augustan cult, of the Roman Empire. And it's in the parody, it's in the blasphemy that true holiness is to be found. Christ is a blasphemous parody of Augustus if you are a Roman.
What they're talking about here is we're talking about the people are so immersed in Christianity. It's like a goldfish who doesn't understand it's in water, and he's trying to get across to us how Tom Holland is. He's trying to get across to us how revolutionary these ideas were at the time.
That is why the figure of Christ is so shocking. And it's why Paul has a sense of himself as such a kind of countercultural, subversive figure. He's not just re-evaluating the Jewish understanding of Scripture, he's also creating a blasphemous parody of the worship of Caesar.
Now, he's speaking of Paul, who is the author of all the Pauline epistles.
And so that sense of there being two kingdoms, two cities, city of God and the city of man, is one that Constantine and his successors will obviously have to negotiate. And then in 410, when the city of Rome itself is sacked, and you get people who've not accepted Christianity saying, this is what comes of abandoning the religiones, the gods are offended. It's what then precipitates the single most influential work of theology ever written in Latin, which of course is Augustine's City of God. And Augustine's argument is a refinement of this idea that is absolutely implicit in the New Testament, the idea that there are two kingdoms, the kingdom of heaven and earthly kingdoms. And those who are in the earthly kingdom belong to the dimension of the saeculum. And the saeculum is the limit of human memory, which could be 80 years, could be 120 years, but generally is held to be 100 years, which is why in due course in French, siècle will become a century, siglo in Spanish. And
now let's just understand for a moment here that when Tom Holland tells you what the great classical works of Latin are saying and what they're about, he is a Latin scholar, and he's in the midst of translating the lives of the Caesars for Penguin Random House, and it's going to be the new standard text. So this is what he does when he's not writing popular history books.
This idea that there is a dimension of the cyclum which is a dimension of flux. It's like the river of time on which leaves are born, you see them fleetingly, and then they're borne away on currents, never to be seen again. And if that's true of individual human beings, then it is also true of kingdoms and of empires and even of Rome. And this is what Augustine teaches. Rome itself is a thing of the cyclum. It is a city of man, and therefore it will be borne away. And our only hope of eternity, the only hope of redeeming ourselves from this flux, from this great river, is the rope ladder that the church can provide, which is the religio, the bond that will join us to the eternity of heaven. And this gets institutionalized in the Latin half of what had been the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire collapses. In the eastern half, it doesn't. And so over the course of the centuries that follow the collapse of Rome's empire in the West, you start to get a sense that is completely distinctive to that outermost, westernmost fringe of Eurasia that you get nowhere else, which is that earthly rulers, earthly autocrats, are not complicit in the dimension of the eternal in the way that they are in Constantinople or Baghdad or the cities of India or China or Japan, that they should back off. And in the 11th century, this conviction becomes strong enough to initiate what effectively is Europe's first revolution, this great project of reformatio, of reformatting, of remaking society in the way that an individual Christian is remade and reborn when he is baptized or she is baptized. So the ambition in the 11th century is to remake, to rebirth Christendom. And that requires kings no longer to have a stake in the supernatural. They can no longer appoint bishops. They have to be humbled in the snow, to be whipped through the streets of their own cities if they offend. And the result of that is that this radical sense of of two dimensions, a dimension of the cyclum, and then a dimension of the church, which provides the religio, beds down over the course of the centuries that follow the 11th century. And by the time you get the Reformation, the secular, it's the Reformation we call it, but it's just a second bout of reformatio, another great convulsion. Things change with the Reformation, but the idea that there is a dimension of the cyclum and a dimension of religio doesn't. Of course, the understanding of religio does change because in the Middle Ages, religio is the particular property of those who are particularly concerned with it, monks, nuns, hermits, whatever. But there are no monks, there are no friars in Protestant Europe. So everyone has a religio. And that bond, what is the individual bond that a Protestant has with God? That becomes the great centre. The idea that it's about your personal belief, your personal relationship, whether you personally have grace, whether you personally reading the scriptures, the Spirit descends on you. And so it becomes much more personalised, even as it's being kind of increasingly shunted to the side of what is coming to be defined not as the cyclum, but as the secular. And if you like, the cyclum has been secularized. The concept of the secular no longer has the kind of theological context that Augustine had given it. And instead, you're starting to get the idea, the more that Protestants come to think that religion is something personal, so the more the sense of the divine can be bled out of the rest of society. And so by the 18th century, you come to have this idea which is entirely distinctive to Western Europe and of course to the various states that are being planted in continents beyond Europe, including the United States. This idea that you have a dimension called the secular, which is separate from something called religion. And Europeans, when they go to the world of Islam, the world of India, China, whatever, export that understanding. And it's something that we have imposed on the rest of the world, and the rest of the world had so internalized it that Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists can all think of themselves as belonging to things called religions, and think of religion as something that exists separate from society. And it can't be emphasized how weird and distinctive and idiosyncratic a way of understanding the world that is. And a huge amount of I think of what's happening in the world at the moment is a kind of kickback against that from people who are not of Christian backgrounds. So I think it's, in a way, I mean, I think it's a huge part of what explains Zionism. And Zionism is an attempt to reverse the status of Jews as people who have a religion. They want to go back to being a people. They want to go back to being the people of Israel. I think that variously Erdogan's rejection of Ataturk secularism and the kind of bloodthirsty literalism of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are both, in their very different ways, responses to a sense that Islam has kind of been Christianized. It's kind of become a religion, which it never was before. And likewise, I think that what's happening in India with Modi is his promotion of Hindutva, his promotion of the idea that India is properly Hindu, is a rejection of the idea that the founding fathers of the Indian Republic, who were all educated in English and therefore with British political and sociological assumptions, they had imported this British concept of the secular. And now Modi wants to get rid of it. And I think that part of the convulsions that are roiling the world at the moment is a reflection of the fact that Western power is retreating, and therefore the categories that the West in its heyday in the 19th and 20th centuries had exported is now kind of coming to seem more shadowy. And the problem that we have in the West is that we don't understand how contingent, how culturally bred these categories are, and how fundamentally Christian they are. Well, that's a long answer.
So that is my introduction. Now, next time we're going to go into more detail, and we're going to talk about this stuff. That's the ancient world part. So in the next section, and I don't have a working title, but maybe we're going to just call it A World Transformed Part 2. How original! But this is the session. Now, I realize I forgot to put in the secret code, which is I as in instinct 514 is the code, secret code. So if you enjoyed this video, please comment and share and subscribe to this series. I hope you enjoyed this, being episode, what is this? What are we on now? Episode 6? Episode 6 of the series, Christianity for Doubters. There are going to be 10 of these things. We've got just a few more left. So stay with me, guys. I hope you've enjoyed these things. And also in the video below, in the comments and the details below, I'm going to put links to the Wikipedia article I used for a reference. And I'm going to put a link to the video that Tom Holland is featured in, and a link to his book Dominion, which is one of the best books I've read in the last 10 years. So anyway, thanks for watching. Take care.